Welcome to today's ADAM Deep Dive webinar. My name's Professor Chris Bain, the lead for the Alliance for Digital Health at Monash, who are organisers of this session. I've had several of these sessions this year, and we look forward to another exciting and interesting one today. And today's topic is getting to the heart of it with digital health. And we have three speakers in addition to myself today. I'm just going to give us some brief introductions before we pass over to our first speaker in a little while. So firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional owners of the lands on which some of you are sitting today, certainly our Melbourne attendees, although I expect, as usual, you'll have people from all over Australia and even internationally. And I'd like to pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging of the Wurundjeri people. A little bit about Monash, and apologies if you've been in these sessions before. We have a lot of diversity and a lot of depth across many areas of academic focus. Monash in Victoria has its primary Clayton campus, but also Caulfield campus down in the Frankston area on the peninsula, campus at Berwick, and campus at Parkville. We also have a standalone campus in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia, which has been just celebrated its 25th anniversary. We have a fairly new campus in Indonesia. We have a partnership with Warwick University in the UK, which I believe one of our speakers will be mentioning today. We also have a conference and visiting facility in Prato in Italy, which is delightful if ever you get the chance to go to that, just near Florence. I'm based in the Faculty of IT, and our Faculty of IT also has links into Harbin University in China, Southeast University in Nanjing, also in China, and to the Indian Institute of Technology in Mumbai, or IITB. That is the premier technology university in India. It's in the top 150 or so universities internationally. And they also now have their Koita Centre in digital health, which has been funded by the Koita Foundation. And we have some partnerships with them as well. Our Digital Health Alliance, or ADAM, has in excess of 35 organisational members, many in the university across our multiple global campuses, but also some in industry, both hospitals, hospital departments, and also some SMEs. And I lead this alliance, which now represents about 480 people. And we have a number of focus areas in terms of where we most focus our efforts around digital health. And we've already had deep dive sessions this year on equity through digital health, on forensic informatics, on neurosciences, and on extended reality for healthcare, looking at issues like digital twins, also on digitally enabled care models and electronic medical record optimization. And today's session is focused on our cardiovascular health and wellbeing area. And in no small part, we have an interest in that area due to the co-location of the recently opened Victorian Heart Hospital with our Clayton campus. There is also an attached research institute called the Victorian Heart Institute, and one of our speakers today represents both of those organisations. And it's important to note that that is the only dedicated cardiac hospital in Australia, and probably only the second, I think, hospital facility on a university campus in our country. It's quite a unique model as well for those who aren't from Australia. So today's speakers, I believe Derek might be caught up clinically, perhaps running a little bit late, but Professor Derek Chew is the Director of Health Informatics Research at the Victorian Heart Institute. Derek's come to us in the last year or so from South Australia. He's a clinical and interventional cardiologist and a cardiovascular health systems researcher. He has completed an MPH at Harvard with training in epidemiology, trial design, biostats, clinical trials and cost-effectiveness analysis. And Derek's PhD thesis explored the factors for improving heart attack care in Australia. He also has a strong interest in digital health and AI, and a particular interest in the system factors that drive evidence translation in cardiovascular care. Our second speaker is Dr. Jackie Wrong. Jackie is a senior lecturer in the Department of Data Science and AI in the Faculty of IT. Jackie does some work with myself and partners in the healthcare system as well. She's a teaching and research academic, also has an affiliation with the Monash Data Futures Institute, and is a member of our AIM for Health Medical AI Lab. So Jackie's interests lie in the joint areas of ML, deep learning and image processing, and their applications in digital health, medical image analysis, cancer diagnosis, cardiac disease detection, in a different field, in pavement and roadway conditions and maintenance, and in tourism management. So our third speaker is Dr. Choi Ying Lee, also goes by Lee. Lee obtained her PhD in pharmacology and physiology from University of Malaya. And in 2009, she joined Monash's pharmacy program of the School of Medicine and Health Sciences at our KL campus. And she is currently a senior lecturer of the School of Pharmacy. And Lee's primary research interests include utilising innovative educational technologies to improve students' engagement, as well as learning effectiveness of pharmacology and pharmacotherapy, and discipline-based research mechanisms that contribute to the development and manifestation of obesity and identifying novel treatments for obesity. And obviously there is a strong relationship between risk factors for obesity and the occurrence of cardiac disease. And Lee will be talking about a particularly interesting application she's worked on, which has support from multiple partners across Malaysia and Australia. And I won't bore you with details about me. Most of you know about me. And that's okay, and we'll speak a bit more as the last speaker today before our panel session. So just to remind everybody of the format for today, there are 4 20-minute speaking sessions with some time for questions via the Q&A if possible. And you can certainly ask questions as the next speaker speaks, for instance, but then we will have some panel discussion in the last 25 minutes or so. I'm just going to hold this up for a minute. So just to save our speakers from being bombarded, this is my email address. I'm more than happy to field questions or comments you may have after the event on any of the things you hear about today, reaching out to the speakers or wanting to know more about some of the projects and initiatives. So it's a fairly simple one, just chris.a.bain@monash.edu. Do not use chris.bain, because that will go to another fellow who is an anaesthetist, and he won't be much interested in helping you. No disrespect to him. I would feel the same. So with that, we might have to change our order a little bit. So I'm going to hand over first to our first speaker today, who'll be Jackie Rong. And we shall begin as soon as I unshare the screen and get Jackie to share her screen. So over to you, Jackie.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you everyone for attending this talk. This is some work we have done related to the pericardial infusion, this work. So in this work, we try to work out something. It's like, how can we detect the heart disease, which is pretty serious cases and cause the first death in globally. So we try to have the disease detected and which may cause the death. So it's quite a serious problem if we can detect them a bit early and find out the reasons why it comes from. And we have a particular setting for this project is under the forensic settings, which we don't work with the patient lively. We have the patient already passed away, and then we have their body kept for a very short time, and then we try to detect, is this pericardial effusion a possible cause for their death? So this is the assumption for this work. So please let me just introduce a little bit for the pericardial effusion, this disease. So we have our normal heart. then if we have some fluid, extra fluid around the heart, it will functionally stop the heart to perform normally. It will have pressure to the heart, and if there's more free fluids around the heart, sometimes it will cause the stopping beating for the heart. So this may cause the death in some cases. And the cause to have the extra fluid may come from very complicated reasons. It's like it may have the existing medical history with cancers or the other disease related, or it may have some injuries which cause the problem, or in most of the cases, it's pretty hard to have the causes clearly defined. And then for that, the traditional way we do the diagnosis for the pericardial effusion is through the medical history, the X-ray scan, or CTs, or ECGs, try to get an idea of what is the possible cause and to identify that from those images. But this may not be very efficient from the very beginning, and they need the clinicians to have years of trainings to have high accurate by reading those results. So for that challenge, we can have the traditional diagnosis method relate totally on the fluidity of the blood. This is not applied for our course because our cases because the blood is stopping and we cannot get it monitored. And then for the images, like the data we used is called the post-mortem computed tomography, that's PMCT, which is similar to the CTs, and it will have the full body scanned at once instead of just looking for a particular part. So we will have a lot of data which may not relevant to the interested regions we are working on for this problem. Also, it's like to have an accurate diagnosis, we need high cost for the training for qualified forensics, and limited human resources and the fundings available so far. So we cannot keep the case stay there for a long time without any conclusion, but there's a lot of case coming every day. So pretty difficult for human beings to manually handle the cases and give the accurate diagnosis in a limited time in time. So this is the challenges for us. We try to use some IT or AI techniques to help to do this. We found like deep learning is a good techniques which have achieved a good performance, especially for image processing. But we haven't got any work to work on this particular topic, use deep learning. So that's why we try to build up some models to detect the possible pericardial effusions directly from the whole body. And also for the assumption of this case is there's few work done in the forensic image processing. Most of them is doing with the live person. So this also give us the limitation, say there's no many work we can refer to or we can build up based. And also, even there's some models, some deep learning model has been used for medical image processing, but the algorithm structure is unclear, pretty hard to explain that because the deep learning is a black box technique. And the data available, especially the open access the data, they are in very small size, like they have few, like a small number of the patient cases available. So it may not be able for us to train the deep learning and get accurate result. And only one slice of the scan is normally extracted for each case. So this also limited the data available. So for our solution, we try to introduce a new framework which help to explain the process in a more general way, how we detect the pericardial effusion from the whole body scanning images. And we also design and modified the deep learning models, which will fit the specific characteristics of PMCT images rather than the original models they were created for the true color image, like large image data set. So we find out also the proposed model, the one we modified, can produce a better accurate result for diagnosis for pericardial effusion. This is the framework we proposed. We called it PEEP, that's Pericardial Effusion Automatic Detection Framework. So we will have the raw data, the full body data coming, and then we take several slides out of each case instead of just one slice from the existing work. We have the training and the testing data separately. The training data will be used to train a deep learning model, which detection, but we break that into two stages. The first one is we try to have the cardiac PMCT images filtered out from the whole body. And then we will have the further models to detect whether they have the pericardial effusion or not. So two steps, easier for us to see how the model works. And then we also test our proposed model, a totally separate test set to have the conclusion. So this is the entire framework we will go through for this work. Then we also do some modifications for the traditional standard CNN model, just because the original model there comes from the requirement of recognize the objects from the true color images without have a clear target. So they deal with a lot of features. So that's why they have a lot of layers, a quite complicated model. But for our case, it may not work in that way because the PMCT examples we have, they are grayscaled. They are normally following the same age of the scaling, and the body positions will not easily change. So compare with the true color images from the ImageNet, we have bit simplified problems to deal with. So the traditional one with very deep models may not be suitable for us because they will need more resources and they will run for a long, long time. So we try to modify that to fit into our particular case. And this is the comparisons between the standard model and the one we proposed. So on the top, they are the standard model. They have many layers, you can see. And the one on the model is the simplified models, which fit the our cases much better. And even like they can reach higher accurate for the diagnosis. So this not only to reduce the complexity, but also improve the performance. And the data we used are from the New Mexico University. So they are very kind to share some data with us. So we have 93 individual cases. And for each case, it contains 1,500 slides. And we have 46 males and 47 females, and with 47 cases with pericardial effusion and 46 without. So it's pretty balanced the data set we have to training this model. Very nice result we have because of the good assumption we set. So we don't need to worry about the imbalanced data problems in many of the medical cases. So we can learn the difference between the normal case and the pericardial effusion cases better. This is some result we have. We have 2 steps in our model, and then we test them separately as well to guarantee that we can have the good result from the step 1 and then passing to step 2. And we have the model we created with less layers, like just 8 layers compared with the standard 19 layers. We have even a better accuracy. So you can see that we increased the accuracy to 96.33%. And also for the other models, CN model, we tried that as well. So 96.01%. So they're both outstanding of the standard model. And then we use that images from the step 1 and then passing to step 2, which only keep the heart region images. Then we also achieve like over 91% accuracy as the best result. So compare with the result reported in the existing literature, which is close to 60–70%, our performance is pretty good. So we are quite confident with this model. And also we do the comparisons between the running time. We simplify the model, so naturally it will have less running time and less complexity of the data. So in that case, we have pretty nice and efficient models compared with the other standard one. So yeah, so showing this figure, right? Then for this work, this is the first step actually in our big project. We've tried to filter out the images from the whole body scan, and then just looking for the interested part, and then we can correctly identify the pericardial effusion cases, reach about 91% of the accuracy. And then based on that, we create much simpler models compared with the traditional ones. And we have the follow-up works that will try to look at what is the potential cause of the the pericardial effusion, and then try to look at what is in those flows. It will be a clear liquid or it will be blood. And then further to that, we hope that we can find like the bleeding point, which may help us to explain the cause of the death. So this will be the entire target, like the final target we have for this project. Yeah, I think that is the work we have done for this disease. And then I'm happy to have any suggestion or questions if you have, and also open for any future cooperation opportunities. If you are interested, please feel free to talk to me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jackie. If you can unshare your screen, that would be great. Just to let people know too, you might have picked up that Jackie's doing that work with the Victorian Institute of Forensic Medicine and also the the New Mexico's Coroner's Office. It's a really interesting and unique space looking at post-mortem image analysis. It's got lessons for the real world, but it's also distinct and challenging in its own way. So feel free to ask any questions of Jackie in the Q&A function, and also to reach out if you'd like to contact her later. So Lee, I might ask you to share from your end, if that's okay, and proceed with your talk, please.
Yeah, sure, Chris. Yeah, first of all, good afternoon, everyone. I would like to thank Chris for inviting me to present this project. Now, education is my primary interest. I'm basically interested in all aspects of education, from teaching and learning, assessment to application of knowledge. So in this project, we developed an augmented reality AR application. We name it Heartbeat, to support undergraduate teaching and learning of atrial fibrillation. This is the University of Warwick, Monash University, Malaysia and Australia collaborative project. We come together because we have the same objective, which is to address the learning challenge that was similarly brought up by pharmacy students and biomedical science students from University of Warwick. Now, students find atrial fibrillation, AF, the most common heart arrhythmia, complex. So students' feedback has been very consistent. So they find AF difficult. They find it complex.
Yeah,
that's why, yeah.
I'm gonna PowerPoint.
Okay. Yeah. So our students, through formal and informal surveys, has noted specifically that electrophysiology, pharmacology of antiarrhythmic agents, interpretation of abnormal ECG, difficult. And because of this, but they become disengaged from their learning. So students' feedback was the main driving force behind this project. Their feedback prompted us to explore new teaching methods, to explain the complexity, to improve the learning effectiveness. Okay, I thought I should touch on this briefly. What is augmented reality? Our researchers define AR as a system that enhances the real world by superimposing computer-generated information on top of it. So it overlays computer-generated information onto the real world. The aim is to enhance the user's experience. So computer-generated information includes virtual objects, text, videos, animations, and sound. So for example, when users look at the screen of their device, they see the virtual image or object, in this case, the Pikachu, appeared on the street. So the background or the street is the real world. So AR is a technology that uses a combination of both real and virtual objects. So I believe AR was made popular by this game, Pokemon Go, launched in 2016. So this is AR. And how do we apply AR to teaching and learning? Or how is it relevant to education? So that requires imagination, I guess. Why AR? I think before we start using a new technology, we need to first understand the technology, meaning what it can do, its features or capability, and then think how we could make it meaningful for us before we start using it. We use it not because of its popularity, not because everyone is using it. We use it because it might help us in some ways. AR gives an immersive learning experience. It allows users to interact with virtual image or objects in a real situation. In other words, it makes learning interactive, so it gives interactivity. Allows visualization of content or scenario. So visualization improves understanding of complex process and mechanism. So importantly, all these features or capability of AR can improve engagement, engage learners, engage students. So how did we develop it? Guided by learning pedagogies, which is the way we teach. So elements of constructivist framework were incorporated into the model developed. So if we look at literature, this is how researchers define this framework. So learning is treated as a development of understanding through interactive experience. So in short, learning as described by this framework occurs when learners interact with the learning materials or content. And this framework was reported to be the most relevant framework for developing AR content. And we developed this application based upon the learning outcomes of our teaching unit or module. Therefore, different from the many resources out there, which may look similar to Heartbeat to this application, we built a tool that is authentic, serves the interests of our students, and meet their learning needs. Okay, sharing here a 2 minutes video, which gives a glimpse of the application and the heart anatomy visualized through an animated AR heart. Okay. All right. I believe some of you might have seen the full video before. This is a shorter version of that. And updates of the applications are ongoing. And the latest version has more features added in. Hopefully, I'll be able to share this application with everyone in the near future. Oops. Need to move. Okay. So we asked students what they think about this application. Here are selected data from the survey. We can see that the majority of the students agree that the application improved the understanding about AF and the treatment, is more engaging than any other tools that have used before, and is realistic. A similar response were recorded from biomedical science students. So more than 80% of students agree that the application improved their understanding and is engaging, realistic, and is a new way to understand complex material effectively. So the application works for students, works for pharmacy students and biomedical science students. So how is it relevant to patient? The pharmacy program focuses on core skills development. This is to enable improved patient care, particularly oral communication skills. Therefore, during the development, we incorporated information that we find is useful for patients or might interest them. Okay, this essentially means that the application can be used to educate patients. So this patient information section includes risk factor of AF, clot formation, medical procedures used for diagnosis, monitoring, and to restore sinus rhythm. And this section was written using layman's terms. If, for example, when users click on clot formation, they see the formation of blood clot, how it detached from the site of formation and leaves the heart and potentially causes stroke. So evidence in our study, Heartbeat, the AR application meets cross-disciplines teaching requirement at higher education, hence could potentially improve patient education. Researchers found that low health literacy is associated with negative health consequences, for example, increased risk of hospitalization and death in patients with heart failure. This also applies to patients with other chronic diseases. So this is the results from systematic review. This systematic review involved a patient who received care in a hospital setting. So the review reports that educating patients with timely medical information through the smartphone or tablets improve their level of knowledge about illness and treatment, medication usage, treatment adherence, satisfaction with the care they receive, clinical outcomes, as well as having a positive effect on healthcare economics. So we think if we educate patients with content that engage them, that may leave a greater impact on patient compared to educating patients verbally or using printed materials. As we know, effective patient education increases health literacy, thereby improving patient engagement to treatment and self-management, and that leads to better clinical outcomes. Okay, since Heartbeat engaged student, we think it may engage patient, but we need to prove this notion by collecting feedback from healthcare providers, for example, pharmacists, nurses working in different healthcare settings, and possibly from patient. Expand the content to include other heart diseases, include patient-focused content. What does it mean? Content that is important for patient to know or understand. For example, information such as lifestyle, behavioral changes, and even quiz to test patient knowledge, their knowledge about treatment, the knowledge about their condition. Okay. And of course, the list can be very long. For example, we can also try to develop the app in different languages and so on. Okay, that's the end of this presentation. I'm very grateful to the team behind this project, to Kevin, who is the co-principal investigator, and also our developers who have worked very hard for this, providing technical support and also their commitment. And of course, not to forget all of students who voluntarily participated in this survey. Thank you. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you very much, Lee. You've already got a couple of questions in the chat there for you, the Q&A function for you. One of the purposes of the sessions we run is to try and showcase some different things from our end across those different focus areas in digital health that I mentioned, that show how different arms of the university and how diverse those groups are. So in this case, as Lee's mentioned, there's people from Australia, from Malaysia, and also from Warwick University, who I mentioned right at the start, have been involved in this project, which is great in terms of getting multiple perspectives in, but it's also great in terms of disseminating the work afterwards. So thank you very much, Lee.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you. And I think you'll be right to go, Derek.
So I want to really talk to you about trying to get AI into clinical practice and seeing whether or not it actually improves hard clinical endpoints. My background is I'm interested very much in myocardial infarction, and in particular, getting doctors to make better decisions around the care of patients who present with myocardial injury. We've run several studies in the past that have kind of demonstrated that doctors are not actually that good at risk stratification of patients. These are patients who present with myocardial infarction, and we ask the doctors to take an estimate of whether or not the patient's at risk of dying or having a recurrent myocardial event. And you can see actually that the scattergram of clinician risk versus estimated risk using non-digital algorithms, it's much more predictive based on a non-digital algorithm. We actually found the other interesting thing was that patients who were when we looked at the treatment of these patients, when you looked at the patients here in red, where the doctors actually estimated the risk of the patients to be increasing, they actually got more guideline recommended therapy, in this case, more angioplasty for the treatment of their myocardial infarct. The interesting thing, though, is that when you actually look at the algorithm, the GRACE score, that is actually a numeric algorithm for the estimated risk of the patient, even though that was more accurate, when you looked at care based on the GRACE risk score, the care declined as the risk of the patient increases. So there's this mismatch between clinician risk estimation and treatment versus algorithm predicted risk. The important thing is that doesn't just translate to a difference in care they provide. It appears to translate to a difference in outcome. So here is the study that we ran. We are actually, as you all know, clinical teams. There are many people in a clinical team who look at each patient and provide the care to each patient. And we could actually determine whether or not one member or the entire team underestimated the risk of the patient. And you can see here in the light gray that it took about a day to get a patient from admission to the cath lab if nobody in the team underestimated their risk. And then rises to 2 days when the entire team underestimated their risk. But most importantly, there was a nearly six-fold increase in 6-month mortality in the groups where there was an underestimation in risk. So can artificial intelligence reduce that risk? We've run a series of studies embedded in practice where we've tried to use new information and new decision-making sequences to see whether or not we can actually improve diagnosis and improve subsequent rates of death and myocardial infarction. And this is the most recent study that we've run that's completed, run in the entire South Australian health system. And we actually found that improving the information available to clinicians actually increased the risk of death and recurrent myocardial infarction. And that's kind of hard to explain, but I think that it does put a sobering light on how we use information, and artificial intelligence is really going to improve our access to information for many patients and for many clinicians. And how that might directly impact the health system, I think, is a critical aspect that we need to look at when when pursuing artificial intelligence and augmented reality within clinical practice. So, however, with this experience of having many clinical trials at our hands, I'm just wondering, do I still have a screen? Is that still presenting, or have we moved screens?
I can still say all good, Derek.
Okay. Just here we go, found it again. What we have available to us is a large amount of data that we had been using to run randomized trials in practice, but also to understand the problem of myocardial injury and myocardial infarction within large-scale registries. And we use this information to develop an algorithm for the detection of myocardial injury and the classification of myocardial injury in clinical practice. We used 2 clinical trials where we had clinical adjudication of each of those events. We then bonded it to ECG data and biochemistry data, and we ran this through 2 algorithms. One, a deep learning algorithm, another an XGBoost algorithm. And we then applied some clinical validation. And what that's given us is really the ability to run a platform, a virtual registry of myocardial injury, for which to run a series of clinical trials and also to potentially evaluate quality in clinical practice. So I need to sort of turn your attention to what we're trying to understand here. And that is that we know that many patients come to the acute hospital environment with evidence of myocardial injury, that is an elevation in their troponin levels. And the tests for troponin have increased their sensitivity dramatically over the last decade. And with this, we're seeing lots of patients with myocardial injury that are not necessarily related to type 1 myocardial infarction, plaque rupture myocardial infarction, the classic heart attack that you see on the Hollywood type TV shows. Many of these patients have non-type 1, known as type 2 myocardial infarction, acute injury and chronic injury. And the important thing to recognize is that these patients don't necessarily benefit from being taken to the cath lab and having procedures. But importantly, they still have a high rate of recurrent events. On this graph, I'm hoping you can see that there is actually a much higher rate for heart failure and arrhythmias over the next 2 years compared to patients with type 1 myocardial infarction. So can you actually develop an algorithm to evaluate the type of myocardial injury and then form a platform for which to study various therapies in practice to see what current therapies might work in improving the outcome of these patients? But importantly, you kind of also want to know whether or not presenting this algorithm to clinicians makes a difference. So we, as I said, we developed this, and we actually ran a two-step process of development. At a clinical level, the first thing that emergency physicians kind of need to know is whether or not this patient has a degree of myocardial injury and whether or not they're safe to go home. And so we ran a model for trying to determine if the patient is safe to go home based on troponin elevation, and that's level 1. And then we ran a model to try and differentiate those who had evidence of myocardial injury into the groups of chronic, acute, type 1 and type 2 myocardial infarction. And the important thing about that is the only group of patients where there is a strong evidence base for therapies for those with type 1 MI. Those patients we know should receive coronary angiography and should have statin therapy and in some cases beta blockers, etc. In many of the other groups of patients, we don't actually have any evidence for what we should do for those patients, and so there is an opportunity to study. What I want to dwell on in this slide is really the performance of the algorithm. You can see the performance of the algorithm at level 1 is 99.4%, i.e. the ability to classify a patient as safe to go home was reasonably good. You know, most clinicians would be quite comfortable with performance at that level. The performance of differentiating type 1 versus type 2 acute injury and chronic injury, of course, is not as good. And you can see here that it's about 92%, but it's probably at a level where, again, clinical implementation of this is reasonable. This is the important purpose of differentiating type 1 myocardial injury versus type 2 acute injury and chronic injury. Again, you can see that for the outcome of mortality on the left, mortality is actually higher in the other types of myocardial injury and lower in type 1 MI. What's interesting, though, is that the instantaneous risk of recurrent heart attacks over time is highest in type 1 myocardial infarction, consistent with the pathophysiology of this problem, which is coronary plaque rupture. Consequently, being able to differentiate these patients is important for picking who to refer for a coronary angiogram, which remains a significant problem for many of our health, and many of our junior doctors in emergency departments, but of significant relevance right across Australia and many parts of the world where access to coronary angiography is not as easy as those of us in big hospitals like the VHH. So the question then, retrospectively, is what happens if, well, let's see what happens. We had all this data, and so the question was whether or not, if the algorithm picked the patient to be of type 1 MI, did they derive a benefit? And if the algorithm picked that the patient wasn't type 1 MI, did they get a benefit anyway from the coronary angiography? And the interesting thing is, with 18,000 clinical presentations, all patients with myocardial injury with follow-up over 3 years, you can see that when the algorithms were able to detect the patient with type 1 MI, there were some patients who got an angiogram and there were some patients who didn't get an angiogram. And those in that setting, those who got an angiogram derived a benefit that was actually remarkably similar to what we see in randomized clinical trials of that therapy. In those patients who were referred for an angiogram, but the algorithm determined that they weren't actually having a type 1 MI, they had no incremental benefit compared to those patients who didn't receive a coronary angiogram, i.e. there was no benefit from reducing, from treating patients that did not have type 1 MI in a retrospective analysis. So I think that artificial intelligence needs to be held to a standard that is similar to how we use drug therapies or how we use device therapies, and in particular, how we use other diagnostics. And quite soberingly, this JAMA network paper still describes that there are only 3 clinical trials in cardiology that have examined machine learning type interventions in healthcare in a randomized manner. And only one of them enrolls more than 1,000 patients, and none of them have demonstrated that this improves clinical outcomes. And I think that if we're going to use artificial intelligence in the healthcare space, we need to hold it to this same standard. Does it improve clinical outcomes? So we're embarking on trying to prove that, or trying to demonstrate that, and trying to build an environment where we continually test algorithms in clinical practice. What we've done in the past is to put a human in the loop to be able to implement offline algorithms in real-world clinical practice and have clinicians review the outcomes that the algorithm is determining to be the outcome of interest. For us, it's type 1 myocardial infarction versus the other forms of myocardial infarction. To do this in real time, you actually have to embed yourself in the data flows of the hospital. So you can't actually do it offline, because if you're going to influence how clinicians make decisions, you need to be receiving and processing the same information at the time that the clinicians are, so that you can insert yourself in the workflow of the clinician in an emergency department. Consequently, when we embarked on this, we had a latency in the data of about a day, and I said to the technical team, this wasn't reasonable, or wasn't going to be something that we would be able to work with. They came back and said that they could offer us a latency of 5 minutes. Again, I felt that this wasn't what we would be able to work with. We've eventually got ourselves to a point where we've got a latency of 30 seconds, which means that we can actually do things in real time and see if we can impact real clinical decision making. So the architecture is complex. It's taken us over 2 years to develop that in the South Australian system and embed ourselves in this. But now I'm pleased to say that we are able to run a clinical trial embedded within practice. And that's the study, the RapidX study. The original plan was for 9,600 patients with 12-month outcomes, where we're actually randomizing emergency departments in the state of South Australia to actually receiving real decision support about myocardial injury to see if it actually improves care and outcome. So this is a map of South Australia, and we've got 6 hospitals in the metro areas and several hospitals in the rural areas. And the beauty of actually having a system that is embedded within the healthcare system is you can actually watch your clinical trial in real time. And so this is data actually from this morning. We have the number of patients enrolled, and you can see the target that we have, that the number of days we're obviously planning on enrolling over. But you can see that the target is around 10,000 patients. And initially we had a bit of a slow start, but we're actually enrolling patients at a reasonable rate now and reaching back to our predicted line. However, what's more important is actually the power of the study is determined by the number of clinical events that you observe. And again, in real-world clinical practice, as opposed to usual clinical trials, we know that there are more events that occur, and our ability to tap into the healthcare system, to embed within real-world clinical practice, means that we can actually observe and run randomized research within the real world rather than what is traditionally a much more artificial environment in selected patients in clinical trials. And so you can see our event rate, and therefore the power of the study, is actually turning out to be much higher than anticipated. And I'm hoping that we might be able to end this study soon. So I just wanted to highlight that this is, the translational journey has been slow and difficult, but it does require a great degree of integration with lots of different teams and lots of people with lots of different skills. If we're going to bring to bear the ability to use artificial intelligence to improve what is at the core of improving healthcare and improving outcomes of patients, at the core of it is improving how clinicians make decisions and choose therapies, then we're going to need to build on all of these capabilities to build a true translational environment for improving clinical outcomes. Just a bit of a flag that once we do it in the emergency department space, we're quite interested to see if we can do it in the ambulance space. And so that will require a whole different networking capability to put it out in the field. But we've received funding to do this already. So this is a slide from one of my colleagues, Christina Lambrakis, who's put her heart and soul into this project. And you can see that, the real thing is, what is it? Is it the generating of the ideas that's the biggest challenge? Or is it really connecting all of this together with people and governance structures and infrastructure? And we know that that it truly is the integrational governance that's required. Thanks for that, Chris.
Thank you very much, Derek. It ended up being a great segue into what I want to talk about myself. You've got one question there already, Derek, so feel free to answer that. I think what we might do is we'll just roll into my talk, but please keep the questions coming for any of the previous speakers. If you want to add any questions in the Q&A relevant to what you hear from me as well, feel free to do that. And then as soon as I'm finished, we'll come back to outstanding Q&A questions and also some discussion. So thank you again, Derek. When it became apparent I was going to talk today, I was thinking about some of the work going on, some of our interests and what might be useful. And I obviously had a good sense that Derek might talk about the kind of work he's talking about, where we're advancing science, but we also want to bring the reality of that science and its implementation into the clinical environment, into clinical workflows, and that doing that whole integration piece that he alluded to at the end there. So I framed our talk today, or my talk today, around this, and to sort of give a bit of a spoiler up front, we'll be talking about ideas around fire and around smart on fire apps, but I'll take those of you not familiar with this on a bit of a journey so you can understand what we're talking about. For those of you who are particularly perceptive, you would have noticed on Derek's slide when he said actually it is rocket science, there was a reference in there to fire, not accidentally, and you'll understand a lot more about that by the time we're finished, even if you're a novice to this. So fire, fast healthcare interoperability resources, said as fire. I've heard a colleague call it FIR. We definitely call it fire. Is a unique and really the only international healthcare data and interoperability paradigm that is allowing true, secure sharing patient data in healthcare. And basically, for those of you familiar in a data level, it's JSON JavaScript object notation for healthcare. And it really is revolutionizing things overseas. It's starting to here. The lag here is really a knowledge and investment gap. There's no reason we can't be doing very similar things to what we'll see from overseas. And we've started to here, and I'll give you an example of it. I think the other important thing here too, which I think I skip over, is there's been a Melburnian heavily involved in this, a gentleman called Graham Grieve, who's very well known in our health informatics, digital health community. And it's through the passion that people like Graham has that we have this now, this open standard. It doesn't cost you money to use FHIR. It costs you knowledge and time and effort to understand it, but there isn't licensing attached to FHIR. If you know what you're doing, you can go out and build FHIR-enabled solutions and FHIR interoperability connections between disparate electronic medical record systems tomorrow. There's no financial burden in a sense of doing that, and that's quite important. So for those of you who don't know, HL7 is an important concept here. So HL7 or Health Level 7 refers to a set of international standards for transfer of clinical and administrative data between software applications used by various healthcare providers. And for those who ever studied the OC model, it's called HL7, Health Level 7, because it's talking about the application layer at level 7 of the OC model. It's used all around the world. There is a strong Australian organisation as well. It's a highly specialised sub-area within health IT and digital health, just as is terminology. Things like Loink and SNOMED and ICD and so forth, specialised knowledge as well. But HL7 messaging standards are critical to the day-to-day functioning of healthcare, best exemplified in large hospitals. So in large hospitals, there are many organisation-wide systems which are essential to the functioning of hospitals, especially in any electronic sense. These can be things like the patient administration system, the PAS system, the laboratory information system, the radiology information system, the electronic medical record, and various smaller clinical information systems. And HL7 messaging is the thing that electronically sends information between these systems. So if a doctor orders a blood test from their electronic medical record, there is a message sent electronically using a HL7 standard to the laboratory system to be received by the laboratory staff. They run their test, and when they issue a result, that also electronically goes back to the electronic medical record system. These standards are so fundamental to the functioning of a healthcare organisation that if the technology fails, they call an internal emergency, because things have to go on to backup systems and even paper-based systems, or else that flow of information, which could be for really critically ill patients, stops. So it's really an important piece of hidden iceberg info structure in the healthcare system. But when you get outside of a healthcare organisation, so looking at the picture between different hospitals, or between a hospital and a general practice, for instance, or a hospital and the specialist rooms, there's a bit of a problem. And we've seen it in the US and the Northern Hemisphere. It's exactly the same here. It will only get worse here, just as it has in the US. So if we look at electronic medical records for an instance, these figures are a little bit old, but they're indicative. So level 7, HIMSS level 7 hospitals are considered to be paperless. They're probably not, but they're considered to be. Everything's electronic. There were about 1,800 level 6 hospitals, so nearly fully paperless in the US, and this is probably a good 5 or 6 years ago. At that time in Australia, we probably had 3 or 4 level 6 hospitals, and that difference is not based purely on population. It's an investment difference and a maturity difference. We're sort of 10 or so years behind. But even in that US setting, basically what's been built is electronic silos. So historically, the ability to share information electronically, seamlessly, quickly from hospital A to hospital B, as the patient moves from hospital A to hospital B, is really no better than paper. It came down to fax and phone calls and letters. And we know that's actually quite dangerous from a patient care perspective. And we know increasingly that patients and the community just won't stand for it. They can move lots of other pieces of their information around society and through different industrial subsections. So why not healthcare? And the trouble with the HL7 messaging is this sort of atomic sharing vehicle is it wasn't really made to work across different organisations. And also it became a bit non-standard. so that the maintenance of it was really difficult. And it was a very old way of thinking about sharing electronic information. So people like Graham, who I mentioned before, and a whole bunch of other people with expertise in this area got their head together and thought, how can we do this better? And they borrowed a model from e-commerce and business-to-business commerce over the internet and said, well, if they can do that, why can't we do that in healthcare? And that was the FHIR thing, and I'll talk more about it in a second. But importantly, the big electronic medical record vendors and especially the big technology companies fully supported the evolution of this, because they could see it as a way to modernise the healthcare IT industry. If one is very cynical, the Apples and Googles and so forth of the world, who weren't purely in healthcare, could see it as a way to access electronically vast amounts of data. Technically, let alone there's a separate conversation about ethics, but that's one of the reasons they supported it. Irrespective, what we have is really a gift for the healthcare industry and in turn for patients. You're not intended to really understand this picture. This is just simply to show you some of the levels of complexity around the FHIR standard. The bit that most people are interested in is down at that sort of level 3, and then the next level, level 4. But what you'll see if you're familiar with healthcare and you have a look at some of those categories there's been an awful lot of thought poured into how do you model and then technically describe lots of different constructs in healthcare in a way that you can work in a standard format and share that information in an internet native way. So how can we share this information across the internet in a way that each side of the transaction will recognise? And to give you an indication of the level of complexity in thought, if you just look at the concept of medications, it goes into the complexity, which we know is there when we stop and think about it. There's a difference between the construct of a medication and the construct of a request for the medication and the construct of a dispensing of of medication and the construct of the administration of medication and so forth. So I won't labour the point, but you can see that that's all been heavily thought about, as has the whole financial elements. A lot of the reason this got support in the US too is they are a very profit-based health system. And so the tying of individual drugs, decisions, tests to the financial implications is very important. But to our benefit, it's been an accelerator of this whole paradigm, even when we just look at it from a clinical perspective. So why do we care about all this? Some of you will know this person's name, a guy called Don Rucker, who's no longer in this position, but he was the head of the Office of the National Coordinator for Health IT, which was the peak US federal government health IT body. I heard him personally say these words in a room a few years ago. Our two biggest problems are usability and interoperability. And I say this, and I'm happy to be quoted because it's true. We have many more problems in healthcare in Australia from failing to appropriately share data than from inappropriate access to data. So inappropriately or being unable to share data kills people. It has done and will continue to, but embarrassment and money might be lost from inappropriate access to data, but nobody dies because of it. I think that's an important thing to remember. So in more practical terms, what does this interoperability problem cause? Well, we certainly have gaps in information sharing to support safe care within and across organisations. Many of you will have had the experience of you go to a hospital or a specialist, 2 weeks later you go to your GP and you expect they know what happened to you at the hospital or specialist, and yet they don't. Now, IT-wise, they could have had an answer to that within 10 minutes, but that's not the issue. There are workflow inefficiencies. So there is, especially in complicated healthcare systems like hospitals, double entry of data, clinicians having to have multiple systems open at once simply because the systems don't talk to each other. And there is also a cost in many ways, ultimately, to society in terms of money, but also having to have tests repeated simply because somebody doesn't know the result of the test that was completed 1 hour, 1 day, or 1 week ago. But even things down to the level of being readmitted to hospital, having adverse events because we can't share information appropriately. I won't bore you with all the details, but basically the US has moved to a mandated through legislation approach where all of these large information repositories, like electronic medical records, are now required by law to be accessible to patients under approvals, but accessible to patients for them to access their own information using the FHIR standard to, for instance, store on a patient app. That's how far ahead of us they are. We still have troubles forcing a hospital to release information even upon request. And that's a complex issue in and of itself. So just for the technically minded, one of the things I didn't appreciate about FHIR when I first learned it was it actually can work in a number of ways. So it can work like older HL7 messaging. It can work like an intermediary approach, which is a little more modern, called clinical document architecture, which is an XML-based document representation language, if you like. So it will represent a surgical report or a discharge summary or a referral letter in standard ways. It also can operate basically as a RESTful API. So you can call upon, if you like, to think of it as a database of FHIR resources. And the SCRUD operations mean you can search for resources on the database, you can create them, you can read them, you can update them, and you can delete them. Our work, and I'll touch on this a bit more at the end, so far has really been dealing with FHIR servers in like a database, even though they're not quite the same thing. And we did run some competitions a couple of years ago where we encouraged people to work with the data in the JSON format to get used to working with it. This is a really handy slide. So the data sharing about FHIR is one part of the value, just simply being able to share. But this concept and this technological framework was put together a few years ago with another group of people who were working on this concept of SMART, of reusable pieces of functionality, reusable apps that could be deployed across multiple other systems. And I'll bring the two arms together in a minute. But it's well illustrated in these diagrams. So one of the troubles inside a hospital, for instance, is traditionally the big electronic medical record systems treat everybody the same. People get the same sorts of functionality, just as happens in any massive organisation when you bring in a massive a massive system. It's all premised on standardisation. And yet we know every day in every way clinical practice gets more diverse. An example I use all the time is orthopaedic surgeons are no longer just orthopaedic surgeons, they're shoulder people or hip people or knee people. So that level of micro-specialisation goes on. And accordingly, the IT needs different specialists have vary. Yes, there's some commonality, but they increasingly need special things. And you just heard an example of this from Derek. So in Derek's work, having specialised decision support about who's at risk of an actual heart attack and its consequences and who's less at risk is very valuable. But a dermatologist doesn't need that, and a neurosurgeon doesn't need that. And so this model allows, through these IT standards, individual apps to be accessed by individual clinicians or groups of clinicians that only they need. And if you like, they can dispense with a series of other apps that the psychiatrist needs or the gastroenterologist needs. And that's what you'll see on this diagram. And both the SMART bit I've mentioned and the FHIR bit work in concert to help with this. So the SMART bit is substitutable medical applications and reusable technologies. So I'm going to do in the next couple of minutes, just checking my timing. Yep. I'm going to give you some examples. These are all real world examples. And I'm going to show you a little bit about where we're up to, just to illustrate It's not actually just a screenshot. So this is a system called emceed, and this isn't cardiac specific, but I'm going to start with this one. It's in the area of wound management. And so as you can see, you can access this piece of functionality, this tool, on a mobile phone or on an iPad. But the idea here is you could take a picture of a wound and you could upload that picture into your electronic medical record. But it can also then be sent, if you like, to this application, which is hosted somewhere else. And the application uses machine learning to analyze the different aspects of the wound tissue, what's good healing, what's infected, what's not healing, and then overlay an AR representation onto the screen. So in essence, you could access all this whilst you're looking, let's say you're in a wound clinic, while you had your patient in front of you in the wound clinic, you had their EMR record open, you uploaded a photo, then you could see within the electronic medical record this very unique piece of functionality that the big EMR vendors were never going to build, but they allow a third party to follow certain standards, build and deploy such applications. And it uses the Fire bit and it uses the Smart bit. This is a more specific one which has a relationship to cardiac care, DoseMe was actually developed by an Australian company, has since been sold to a US company. It was available for Cerner, and you'll have to excuse me when we say Cerner, what we're actually meaning these days is the product formerly called Cerner Millennium, owned by Oracle Health. But what this product does, it's a pharmacokinetic profiling tool, if you like, and it's designed to be used with complicated drug regimes. Think of things like gentamicin and vancomycin in the antibiotic realm, or warfarin in the blood thinning realm, which is relevant to cardiac care. So these drugs need a knowledge of, if you're about to prescribe the next dose, you need a knowledge of the patient, their weight, their age, recent blood tests, what were their recent doses, what impact did they have on those blood tests, how long is it since the last dose? And this historically was educated guesswork with a bit of guidance. And the idea here is that the electronic medical record system has all that information, and then that information can be sent into the DoseMe application, and it can provide advice using a Bayesian model of what's the next appropriate dose and when might you give it. And there is good evidence in research papers about the impact of that quite separately. But again, it's a model of one of these smart on fire applications. This is some examples now from cardiology. So in this case, this company called Implicity has a remote monitoring platform for diverse ranges of remote monitoring and implantable devices. So if you're a cardiac clinician who runs a particular clinic where all your patients have some kind of remote monitoring, again, you might be in your electronic medical record system. You know that you've got a series of different products your patients are using, but you could get an integrated view of everybody in your clinic today by opening this app within your electronic medical record system. Otherwise, you need to have a separate login or a separate system, potentially hosted in a separate place. And there are risks around that. This is another one. This is a case of using a smart on fire approach for cardiovascular risk and risk assessment. And you can see the kinds of things this risk model uses. So cholesterol and subset of cholesterol values, what drugs are you on, what's your blood pressure, and on the right there, what sort of risks are you having. But the idea, again, is you would be in your electronic medical record or clinical information system, you would click a button and a lot of that data would be imported into this third-party app and those results displayed in front of you along with all the other patient information without having to open another system, which you may not have trust in, for instance. This is a more an ecosystem. So this initiative is called the Connected Health Innovation Research Program. and it's interested in the intersection of cardiology and oncology. And these people, like I say, are trying to build an ecosystem where they incorporate wearables and smart BP monitors, but even things like T-shirts with embedded sensors. And importantly, here is the quote, and it talks to the inevitable role of Smart on Fire as a paradigm in bringing together that kind of vision, bringing that vision to life. There really isn't another way to have all that data integrated and shared. In this one, this is similar to some of the work Derek displayed before. So this is called the Heart Pathway, multiple publications about it. Again, feel free to look those up. Again, uses a Smart on Fire approach. And importantly, down the bottom, the Heart Pathway assists with answering two important questions. What is the likelihood that my patient's presenting symptoms represent acute coronary syndrome? And what is the likelihood that my patient will have an acute coronary syndrome event in the near future, so within 30 days? So this idea of having apps inside big concrete systems that are a bit inflexible, that give bespoke, unique, interesting functionality to specialised clinical groups, where that functionality can be very complex. It can be AI-based. It could even be from a system on the other side of the world. You're just paying a license to access it, all while it's integrated into your workflow is the key message here. We're very interested in this space. We've made leaps into this space already, and we're looking to work with more and more people. So I'm just going to illustrate one little feature there by resharing something else. So just bear with me a second. Okay. So now you should see a little simple app. This is a web app. It's hosted inside the Monash environment. I'm just trying to illustrate for you this concept of quick and easy sharing. And I'm going to do that by just showing you the difference between two fire servers. Now, these both happen to be, they're quite separate servers, and I'll illustrate that. They do happen to be both in the Monash environment, but one could be in London, for instance. It doesn't matter. Okay, this is what this enables, and this is all over the internet. So you can see our current list of patients, which is quite a few pages long, but, you know, we've got, I made this patient up the other day. So Chris Bain, female, address, and so forth. These are all basic fields in the fire resource for patient. We could have been pulling clinical data there. We're not, doesn't matter. Let's come back to there. So you can see how we've got these more recently added patients with IDs 134 to 1834 to 1840. And then if I switch to our other server, you'll see they're not on it because they're two different data sources, if you like, two different databases, to keep it simple. But the databases are fire servers. And like I say, I could have just flicked between one that's in Melbourne and one that's at the North Pole. And once that's set up, we could have a list of 20 different ones there that easily, again, show you the same thing. So the app functionality is the same. The data source is different. And it's really just to give you that idea. So in this case, we're using these servers as different options to show different things, but you'll appreciate that if you can that easily connect to another server over the internet, you can that easily share that data over the internet as well if you have permission. So really the idea there was just to bring to life for you how cutting edge IT, and we have a strong interest in it, as do many other people, is starting to enable much better support for clinicians and workflows. The Austin Hospital in Melbourne now has access to that sort of infrastructure attached to its Oracle Health implementation. A number of other hospitals in the area are also looking at this functionality or this capability. If you're interested in it, you can look at the Smart App Gallery online, and that will give you a sense of all sorts of other apps that have been built. I've just pulled a couple of examples of cardiac relevant ones. But with that, I will stop talking. And I see we've got some questions there. There's still a couple there for you, Derek. I'll let you ponder those verbally, Derek, and I'll come to you in a second. There's a question from Steve Gardner and a question from Richard Lunds, and I'm going to try and answer Andrew's because it's for me. So, Andrew, in essence, so Andrew's asking about a permanent record of our healthcare data held at a federal government level, for instance, like is done for immunisation tracking. In many ways, that's a holy grail. The short answer is, do I see that ever happening in Australia? No. And the reason I say that is the whole hoo-ha that people put up around my health record, which was much less compulsory, much less complete, and yet it was still seen as a fundamental threat to people's privacy. There's been some similar noises of late in Victoria. So Victoria has devolved health service governance. What that really means is, unlike, say, Queensland is an extreme opposite, where everybody in hospitals works for the one organisation and they have standardised system. Hospitals in Victoria are free to do their own IT, essentially. They get a few incentives to not go too divergent. What that means is the health department in Victoria has had to recently lead work which allows the sharing of critical clinical information across healthcare organisations. They had to get legislation changed to do that, and they still have people complaining that it's a threat to their privacy and personal information. So in our culture in Australia, the concept of especially a federally government-held single source of truth around our healthcare data will not happen, in my opinion. Derek, could I get you to talk to Steve Gardner's question there? So Steve's saying, what's your hypothesis as to why increasing the amount of information available to doctors resulted in worse outcomes for patients?
So I just typed a response, but it just simply leads to over-testing and under-testing. So that if you provide more information to a clinician, it changes their, if you like, sensitivity or specificity for the disease you're pursuing in a way that you don't really have strong evidence for. To put it another way, giving a clinician some information that might be overly reassuring might prevent them from ordering an appropriate subsequent test, or showing them an abnormal result, but not really in a manner that is indicative of a disease. It just is now abnormal. In the past, we didn't consider it to be abnormal. Then shifts their practice to undertaking more tests or more treatments that don't necessarily provide a benefit. And so that's why I think we do need to prospectively evaluate how we impact decision-making and whether or not that actually translates to care and outcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Derek. Derek, there's another one from Richard, which I might let you answer offline, but if you don't want to, I can answer it in a second. Conscious getting some other people to talk as well. Just a quick one from Kate Swinnell. Thank you for attending, Kate. Daniel McCabe, who from memory is the Federal Health Department Secretary now, said in Sydney today that path and diagnostic imaging providers will have to share data to My Health Record as a default by December 2024. How much will that improve things? Personally, I think that's a good thing. What I keep hearing from people, especially people who are passionate about the use of My Health Record for themselves or people they care for, is a tendency for healthcare providers to not want to use the My Health Record and not make the efforts to do things. So I think any default uploading of stuff that's already there, that's got a home in the My Health Record, is a good thing. Again, because the My Health Record is never going to be, and was never intended to be, a comprehensive record of truth for people. It was not set up that way. Nothing about it was designed to be that way. But what it can be is a good backup in certain circumstances where you don't have other information, and what it can be is a good enabler of what what people want, and can they, at least having that vehicle available to aggregate data if that's what they want. You can't do it if there's no ecosystem for it, no technical framework, and you can't do it if the providers won't play ball with you as well. One man's opinion, but hopefully valuable. Jackie, I've got a question for you. Might get you guys to pop your cameras on if you can for me too, please. So, Jackie, are you able to talk quickly about differences between the work you're doing? What are the differences you've seen or are aware of between doing it in the post-mortem population and the living population? Be they technical or ethical or whatever.
Yeah. We will have the ethical problems, and then we need to get the ethical approval for get the data from the live patient. And also we facing the problem maybe is they may not have the entire medical history available for us to access, because they may have visited different doctors at different institutes. So that will be the challenge we are facing right now. And also it's we would happy to see some of the cases may develop a bit slow, so we can get some idea from their historical data. But some cases may happen pretty rapid and quickly, so pretty hard for us to track the real causes for the deaths. But we try our best to do that. Yeah.
Yes. And for people who didn't perhaps pick up, why is this worth doing from the forensics perspective? Why are we bothering to do this? Some people would say, well, they get an autopsy anyway, so the pathologist will actually examine the body in detail. What is this hoping to add, and why is it important?
Because not all the cases that we can do that because of the religion problems or the the suggestion, the consideration from the family. So we may not be able to touch the body. So it will be better we can do the scan. And another reason is in most of the cases, they want to have the body back to the family in 1 or 2 days. So it really leave us limited time to do a comprehensive examination. So this is the challenge, yeah.
Yes, and just to fill in too for people perhaps not familiar, I mean the Victorian Institute of Forensic Medicine is really a national treasure. There's not many places like it in the world, let alone in Australia. They are the scientific arm of our coroners court in Melbourne, but they also have had deep academic affiliations for many years, and they have systematically acquired death data as well as providing a service to living patients for a long time, including things like CT scans. It's been very interesting to work with them through the COVID pandemic too. Paradoxically, we had it bad in Australia, but nowhere near as bad as many countries overseas. If you imagine how many deceased people we could have had in Australia with, in scientific terms, unknown causes of death. Yes, probably COVID, but unknown, and the load that would put onto that system, it's frightening. And they were making contingency plans for that. So the long story short is any automated diagnostic techniques through scanning or blood test analysis that can more rapidly give families in the legal system an answer about causes of death is a good thing. And relying on full autopsies, which can take many hours and have a limited workforce, is not sustainable in the long term. So that's some of the further background for you as well. Lee, I wanted to thank you, Jackie, too. I wanted to drill down a little with more with you. You mentioned about subsequent work. I can think of a few really interesting things for pharmacy students or biomedical students in physiology and the impacts of drugs that could lend themselves to a similar approach. Have you done any deeper thinking about what might come next?
You mean future studies for
Yeah,
students?
yeah, or
Yeah.
different rather than just the heartbeat, different applications. So maybe renal physiology or the how do anti-epileptic drugs work, for instance.
Yeah, of course. We are interested to expand the study to include other disease, apart from heart disease, like what you've mentioned about renal, about lungs. These are the things that we plan to do. And of course, for both student education and potentially patient education, how we can make the patient education more effective. I think that's the ultimate aim. Yeah.
Very good. You're looking for industry partners or other academic collaborators? This is a good time to mention if you are.
Yeah. Especially those who are doing clinical research, because if you want to collect data from hospital, we need clinical researchers. And if you're interested, do contact me so that we can plan how we can administer or start the study in a more effective, efficient, or of course, practical way to start the work at hospital. Yeah, thank you for mentioning that.
A little bit self-interested in mentioning it too. People may have seen when I showed our different areas of focus at the start that extended reality in healthcare is an area. Partly that's for education for students and patients and families. Partly also for things like digital twins, which we have an interest in. We previously presented some work we're doing on a digital twin for ECMO training. So we're very interested in hearing from people in the community across multiple areas of AR, VR, and its use in healthcare as well. Now I'm just looking here. Sorry, Lee, did you want to add something?
No, that's fine. Thanks. Let's carry on. Yeah.
So I'm not seeing any outstanding questions. I might just give people a couple of seconds of airtime if they wanted to ask any more questions online. There's one I wanted to ask you, Derek, as somebody, you're living the clinical world every day. And, as we saw, you can have your day rapidly impacted by an emergency very easily, but you're also working in AI. And I completely, and I think most people who work in this space completely support your contention that we need adequate levels of evidence, certainly when we're talking at pointy end clinical applications of AI. But do you see other opportunities? And part of the reason I'm asking is, on one hand, we know the system's under enormous stress. There's been huge staff problems, even more so after COVID. There's never enough money in the system. There's always more demand in the system. It can take many years to get a drug approved. It can take many years to get a pointy end clinical application of AI approved. But do you see other opportunities that can get onto the floor and help people more quickly?
Absolutely. You've got my video controlled there, so I can't come on video. But absolutely. If you think about healthcare just as a concept, healthcare has always been about decision making and getting a better decision that is specific to the patient and their needs more rapidly. That's the core. And what we lack and what is actually fragmenting in the healthcare sector is really the ability for people to make those decisions as quickly as possible. So in other words, we're subspecializing. What we actually probably need is more people to be able to function at the bottom of everybody else's scope, rather than a whole bunch of people functioning at the top of their own scope. We need, and that's where I actually think augmented reality and artificial intelligence is going to actually deliver its benefits. I need a junior doc to make a senior decision about myocardial injury or heart failure or arrhythmia management. I don't need more senior docs making senior decisions around that. They're kind of good at that already. So it lifts everybody else up, and whether or not we can then extend that decision-making to nurses, allied health, but actually, couldn't we do it with the patients? If the patient was actually making choices around the information more directly, then that's the ultimate democratization of information that artificial intelligence offers us.
Couldn't agree more, Derek. But when I first came to this job from working in hospital IT, and I had to contemplate what is digital health in essence, and what makes it different from what I've been doing for the last 15 years, I came up with a series of hallmarks that described what I was seeing. And one of the hallmarks, yes, is AI, but I use it in the sense of augmented intelligence. And yes, artificial intelligence can be a way to deliver it, but so can smart visualization, so can AR and VR, so can better clinical decision support systems. How can we augment the capability of human beings through these technologies? And that can be all sorts of human beings, but completely agree with you. It's, sometimes we do get stuck on the technology rather than the impact. It's always important to remember what it is we're actually trying to achieve. Just having a look there. Bold opinion from Professor Chu. It can be contentious. And I personally rail against protectionism, if we shall cut through and make a simple statement. But some of this is reality. Yeah, it's interesting.
I'm not worried about somebody taking my job. At the moment, at this pace, you can have it.
Yeah, very, very good perspective. Very good perspective. But I think in answer to Andrew, try and be a bit more serious, the current model is not sustainable. How we've thought about all this is not sustainable. We can't just keep throwing more beds at the hospitals or the healthcare system and throwing more clinicians of different kinds and people at it and expect that alone is going to make our healthcare system better, because it hasn't for the last 50 years. So,
yes.
All righty. I think we're right there on questions. Look, with that, I might start to draw things to a close. I'm sure some people are keen to have dinner, other people are just keen to go home. So firstly, I would like to thank our audience for attending. Thank you very much for, again, supporting our event. I'd really like to thank Derek and Lee and Jackie as our speakers today. Thank you very much for their time and their expertise and their insights, and also to thank our great behind-the-scenes team, Heather and Ankit, who put these events together. We've had a great series of events this year. May do one more before the end of the year. We'll see. We have some other events planned, but certainly if not, we'll continue these next year. So again, thank you very much, everyone, for your involvement, and I wish everyone a good evening.